Good evening, friends. What a few weeks it's been. I've not been around. I went camping with a bunch of my friends, went out to the bar. When I came back, they were all dead, but stayed at the bar, so I lived. So good for me. I survived Camp Blood. If that doesn't tell you anything, today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite installments of the Friday the 13th franchise, Friday the 13th Part 2, and one of my favorite final girls of all time, Ginny. So, here we go. You're all doomed. Doomed.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
What got me in the idea of talking about this, which was going to be originally 2 weeks ago, was that May 3rd was Amy Steele's birthday, and Amy Steele, who plays Ginny in part two. And that got me just thinking about the movie. And also, I just finished reading a book called The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. And I might talk a little bit about that after the movie discussion, because it definitely is something that I do want to talk about, and I just finished it today, so it's like, I'm still processing it in my head, but highly recommend it for any horror fans, and especially if you are a fan of the 80s 90s slasher films. It's such a love letter to them while also really being its own thing. But anyways, so Amy Steele, who plays Ginny, it was her birthday just a few weeks ago. And the character of Ginny was one that always resonated with me. Friday the 13th is the horror franchise that is the most nostalgic, and because of that, kind of the dearest to my heart. I would watch those movies as a very young child and sometimes be completely convinced that Jason was outside in the woods somewhere coming to get me. But especially with the first two, three movies all being very similar in formula, it wasn't until I got a little bit older and started watching them again that I realized, like, oh, that happened in part one, this happened in part two. And a lot of my strongest memories did happen to be from part two, particularly because of the final girl. What I love about Ginny is how resourceful she is, and that she uses her child psychology studies to get into Jason's head at the end of the movie. And that always just weirdly stuck with me, the scene where she puts on Pamela Voorhees' sweater and he's like, Jason, mother is speaking to you, and really gets him to submit, and he thinks that it is his mother. And I just always thought that was so cool and something I hadn't really seen before. And with a lot of other franchises and final girls, that is very, very unique. Granted, with all the sequels and different installments, a lot of the final girls do get more development and a lot more chances to be a badass and to shine. You see that a lot with Laurie Strode in Halloween, and you see that a little bit with Nancy in Nightmare on Elm Street. But for only being in the one film, it was originally planned for Ginny to return in part three and really deal with her trauma from what had happened in part two and her learning martial arts and meeting up with Ted again, which we'll come back around to Ted because I love him. But that ended up not happening, and part three went a completely different way. But for having only one film, Ginny just really shines. She has a natural charisma, and she's just very, also just very natural. She doesn't, and that is something with a lot of the characters in part two, which really endears me to it, is the acting is very naturalistic. Not all across the board, but with the college students slash teenagers who are training to be counselors, everything feels a lot more more at ease, I guess, especially in comparison to part one. And Ginny just, she is just, she so smart. And even though she is dating Paul, who is the head counselor and head of the counselor training program, she's always kind of giving him a bit of a, almost a side eye and like, so I like you, man, but I'm real sick of your crap. And which I absolutely love. And Amy had said about her performance that she, being a young woman, had a sort of natural suspicion of overconfident, cocky men, and that came into her character, and it's wonderful. I really, really appreciate that. And I know everybody loves part one. Of course, I do too. It's the first, and the fact that it was Pamela Voorhees being the killer and not Jason just really turned on its head. And, obviously her performance is absolutely incredible. You gotta love Betsy Palmer. She's fantastic. And Adrienne King as Alice is like, she's great. And of course, young Kevin Bacon. But part one really does show its lack of budget and lack of direction. It does slog along at many points. And part two, which came out only 10 months after part one, you could tell that the budget was greater. Paramount was chomping at the bit after the success of part one and put a lot more money into the sequel. And you can really see that, especially with the use of Steadicam, which was purchased for the second film. And overall, even though there are meandering points in the film, but it never drags. And at least in my opinion, it doesn't drag in ways that part one tends to. And it's just a lot tighter, and the characters are all much better written. And you, at least with a few of them, you do feel genuinely upset when they die, because even though they don't have a ton of screen time or a whole lot of backstory, you get a lot of their personality and who they are. And most of them are genuinely enjoyable, relatable people. And it makes it that much scarier and more upsetting when they do meet their demise. Probably aside from Ginny, my favorite of the doomed counselors are Mark and Vicky. They're like my favorite couple. I like them as a couple better than Ginny and Paul. I think Paul is kind of a dick, but he's fine. He's not terrible, but he's whatever. But Mark he's such a sweetheart, and he just seems like such a good guy. And I'm talking about being in the wheelchair, you just really feel for him. And part of what I love about him and Vicky, first of all, they have incredible chemistry. These two are adorable. And the fact that she is just hitting on him so hardcore. It's like, it's really, you're used to seeing the guy being the more aggressive one or the more overtly flirtatious. And in this one, it's turned around, but it's obviously she wants to sleep with him and it's reciprocated, but she genuinely likes him. And you really see that. And in real life, the actress who played Vicky did have a crush on the actor who played Mark. He gently turned her down because he was gay, but you do see that genuine affection there on screen. And it's just, I think it's really lovely. And when they're playing games with each other and he's like, "Oh, like what are you playing for?" and she just goes, "Position." Like, "Yes, get it, girl." And both of their deaths, I think, hit the hardest. And I think Mark's is probably the most impressive kill of the film. When he's in his wheelchair and he just gets macheted in the face, and then the wheelchair proceeds to roll back through the rain and go down several flights of stairs. And it's really disappointing that almost a minute of footage was cut from part two thanks to the MPAA. And I know almost a minute. I think it was maybe between 40 and 50 seconds. But as far as the gore effects, that is a lot. And it's, and with what they were working with and how quickly they had to put all this together, it's really impressive. And it's disappointing that it's not shown on screen. Now, in I think 2021, the footage of like the full footage of all of the kills was finally found, and it was released on the I think Scream Factory box set or the DVD, so you can see it, which is great. It is out there, and if you are able to see that or find it on YouTube or something like that, I definitely think you should, because it's, you get to see what the team, like more of their work in focus, and it's great. But Mark's kill, they made a fake head and had a wooden machete go through it. And the makeup and gore effects of part two is a little bit of a story of its own. Tom Savini dropped out of doing the effects because when they figured out that part two would continue with Jason as the killer, that didn't make sense to a lot of people. The original director dropped out. Tom Savini was like, "This doesn't make sense." He noped out of that. And then they brought in Stan Winston to do the makeup. And he actually created the Pamela Voorhees head that is in Alice's fridge in the beginning. But he had to go work on another project. So there was just a scheduling conflict. So he had to leave, which left only 6 weeks, I think, for either 6 weeks or 6 months. I know it sounds like a big difference, but still, there was a lot less time for all of this to be put together. So kudos to the makeup for being able to pull it together and do really, really good work. Let's see. Carl Fullerton, because I want to give credit is due. Carl Fullerton was the one who ended up taking the reins of the makeup effects, and I think he did a really, really great job. And then one of the other big kill of part two, what it might be as far as the kills, although I think Mark's is the most impressive, but what part two might be most famous for is the infamous bedroom kill, the the spear going through the two lovers. Let's see, Sandra and Jeff, I believe, are their names, and basically identical to one of the kills in Mario Bava's Bay of Blood, which Dino and I covered a few months ago on our Sunday stream, which I'd seen had that was my first time seeing it. So it's really fun now having seen Bay of Blood and then coming back to Friday the 13th. It's a lot of fun. But that kill it is almost the same, and the film itself is very similar. You have the cabins on a lake and the woods, and killer picking off young pretty people one by one or sometimes two by two. But apparently director Steve Miner said that he had never seen Bay of Blood.
Right.
Yeah, right. But if whether or not that's true, Phil Scuderi, who was one of the backers, I have a feeling he probably had that might have been his idea to do the kill that way. But interestingly, to achieve the effect, it was done pretty similar to Kevin Bacon's death in part one, where the actors were standing in a hole beneath the bed so the spear could go through a back made of latex. The actor who played Jeff has said in interviews that he was very, very physically uncomfortable until a sound guy offered some help and just blew some powder into his mouth, and then he was smooth sailing from there. A lot of shenanigans going on this set. And that seems to be kind of a trend for a lot of the Friday the 13th films. Now, most of the actors had a really fun time. It was 8 weeks of shooting, and for a lot of the actors playing the counselors, it basically was like an extended camping trip. However, for Amy Steele, who played Ginny, it was a lot more rough for her. For one, doing many, many night shoots and always having to pretend to be scared. And there was a lot of on-set injuries. Amy was hurt a few times. There's one moment when she escapes out a window and she comes down really hard. It looks like it genuinely hurt. And she has said since then that she almost did feel like a stunt woman, and like she was told that she might as well get stunt credit. Adrienne King, when she reprised her role as Amy, as Alice. All these A names, it's a lot. But when Jason kills her in the beginning of the film, the ice pick that he puts into her head, it didn't retract completely, so it was just boring into her temple a bit. And lots of things going on. Steve Dash, who played Jason, except for one part in the film, technically two, but he plays Jason throughout most of the movie. He was injured several times he got hit with a real machete. Amy was exhausted and shaking, and she accidentally hit him, and he had to go to the hospital, but he went to the ER with a fake machete in his back as a prank, which is really fun. Steve Dash seemed like a very, very interesting fella. Let's see. He broke some ribs during a jump when he landed on a pickaxe. He hurt his wrist stabbing a door with a pitchfork. And Jason does not yet have the famous hockey mask. He's just wearing a burlap sack. And one scene where Steve Dash is wearing it, part of the flour sack was flapping around his eye, so the crew used tape to hold it back. And after, hours and hours of filming, Steve Dash got pretty bad rug burns around his eye from it just rubbing against him for for an entire shoot. So a lot of the things going on the set, and also, this was the early 80s. So things could and did happen on film sets back then that just would not fly these days, and for good reason. But, to me, it seemed like a mix of genial, but like a lot of people had fun, but also maybe a bit unprofessional or maybe juvenile. It was the director, he was 29, and this was his first time directing. So a lot of those kinks did happen more so off screen than on, which is a pretty impressive feat. And I mean, I personally would love to be in a film like this if the studio, like all of the nonsense going on with Friday the 13th ever gets sorted out and they are able to get back to making any new Friday the 13th movies. I would just love to be in on that. Just, give me a cool death or something. But hopefully not with all of the behind the scenes nonsense. And when and if I ever talk about later chapters of Friday the 13th, there is some more things that happened, including one of the Jason actors nearly leaving the production because he didn't really like seeing a girl being in freezing water all night. But another time, another video, maybe. We'll get there. Now, one character I wanted to come around to was that of Ted. Ted is one of my favorite characters throughout the franchise in general, because he does just feel so real, and his friendships with the other counselors it feels completely genuine, and just the way that he interacts with people, you totally buy that these are friends who have known each other for a while and have worked as counselors together before and have had some fun nights. And also, in a lot of other films, he might be the sort of stereotypical nerd that is maybe bullied or made fun of a bit. But I really enjoy that he's one of the gang and everybody loves him. And I don't know if one of the character designers or animators at Pixar really likes this movie, but not Remy, that's the rat. Linguini from Ratatouille looks exactly like him. Put them side by side, it's uncanny. So I don't know. I really hope that it was an intentional thing, that someone at Pixar was just like, you know who would work for this Linguini character? Ted from Part 2. Let's do it. So that just gives me so much enjoyment. But, and that is, what I was talking about earlier. The acting and just the characters in Part 2 just feel so much more natural than in Part 1. The acting isn't quite as stilted. You have a few moments here and there, but most of the core counselors do feel like they are actual friends, and they're chemistry and sense of humor really comes across on screen. And part two does have a genuine good sense of humor. There are also just the line delivery is good at one point when they're grilling out and guy's like, come and get it. And he's like, I'm right here. And there is a there is a jump cut that is brilliant when Muffin, the little dog, encounters Jason in the woods, and then it cuts to a row of hot dogs on the grill. There's just little things that, little things like that that make the movie fun. And I'm not going to say that this movie has the most clever writing of all time, because no, but it does have good setup and payoff and things that maybe in other movies would just happen because the plot needed it to. It actually is established. For one, with Ginny being in graduate school to be a child psychologist. Paul mentions that early on, and then she kind of throws it back in his face when she kind of pranks him. It's great. And then when she goes out to the bar with Paul and Ted and the counselors who don't get names and who also get to survive the movie, she brings up the psychology of Jason and of Pamela Voorhees. So then that moment when she comes across the shrine in Jason's hut, whatever you want to call it, and she gets the idea to put on Pamela's sweater and pretend to be her to survive and to get Jason to back off. And so that is set up very well to where it makes sense. Another thing when I did my recent rewatch of part two was Ginny's car. Now, it's a trope of its own in horror movies where the car never starts when you need it to, and always you're twisting the key and going, come on. But it's set up upon Ginny's arrival at the camp. You hear the car you hear it making terrible noises, and Paul works on it, and she's late to the training because, as she says, my car is sick. And I love that she says, my car is sick, not that, oh, my car is breaking down or, oh, having car trouble. She said, my car is sick. I'm like, aw, poor car. Ginny, I love you so much. And then when they are leaving the bar to go back to camp, Paul says, let's hope it starts. So then later when she is trying to get away from Jason and she goes and can't start the car, it's been already set up that the car has issues and poor baby car is sick. So it's doesn't come out of the blue, and it's not just for convenience sake. And I really appreciate that because this movie, well, any horror movie has a lot of leaps of logic, and this one also with the continuity of and things that were set up in part one. But they did their due diligence to make things make sense and not have it be super in your face about it or be introduced in a really ham-fisted way. So I give the movie major props for that. Now, part two kind of does what Evil Dead does with the beginning of it basically recapping what happened in part one and then just going and doing its own thing. But it's almost it is a sequel to part one, obviously, but it almost is a soft remake or a soft reboot because it is essentially the same story, except with Jason being the killer rather than his mother. I don't mind it, though, because it is full of characters I actually enjoy and relate to, and a final girl that is amazing. But I was always confused about the mythology of Jason and still am. Because in part one, it's, as most of us well know, Pamela goes on her killing spree because Jason drowned as a boy at Camp Crystal Lake, and she blames the counselors because they weren't watching him, and that drives her to madness and killing counselors way after the fact. But then we have the wonderful jump scare at the end of part one where swampy boy Jason jumps out of the lake and grabs Aleece, and we don't really know if that was a dream or what happened. But then part two, which begins 2 months after the events of part one and then skips ahead to 5 years afterwards, but we have adult Jason. And did he, and they set it up, and that he didn't drown after all, but he was just living in the woods, living and catching animals and to eat, and just being a wild man for all of these years, and then witnessing the death of his mother. But so was he not a little boy? If he did survive, why wouldn't he just go home? It's, I've never been quite able to figure that out. And none of the movies really clarify it. And not even the reboot in 2009, which does portray Jason as having survived until adulthood and being a survivalist, basically. Yeah, doesn't really address why his mother thought he was dead, or, it's been a while since I've seen that one. Maybe it's more explained. If I am missing something or forgotten something, which is very, very possible, let me know in the comments. But yeah, that is something I have never been clear on, even though I have been watching these movies since probably before I could form memories. So I don't know. It doesn't really bother me. I can look past a lot of things when it comes to horror movies. So, that isn't, it's hardly the most ridiculous thing that happens in the Friday the 13th franchise. There's a lot more things you have to wrap your head around and just let go of. Whew. But yes, and maybe I'll talk about the 2009 version at some point now that I think about it, because it doesn't get talked about a lot, and I'm trying to remember if I liked it, because I saw it in theaters and I remember enjoying it, but I haven't seen it since, so I can't comment on if it holds up or if it is actually any good. So I don't know, maybe I'll just jump into that in the next week or in the next coming weeks. But beyond that, also, any excuse to talk about Jared Padalecki. But moving on. Now, as I mentioned, I just read the book, The Final Girl Support Group. And reading that and partially listening to it really gave me just so much nostalgia for a lot of these slasher films, but also really seeing them and the final girls themselves in a very different light. And if you listen to the audiobook, it's actually really great. Adrienne King herself, who plays Aleece in part one and the beginning of part two, she narrates the book, which is amazing. And it's really, really sad what happened with her. A lot of people know that after part one came out, she had an intense stalker, and the studio basically turned a blind eye. At one point, the guy got into her apartment, had her at gunpoint. Like, it was intense. And then when she came on to play Alice again in part two, she didn't know until she arrived on set that her character was going to die. There had been, I think there had been a rumor going around that her agent was pushing for her to get more money, which is why they killed off the character. I don't know 100%, but she has said that when she came in, it was a hostile environment on set. And that entire beginning with Alice, none of her lines were scripted. Everything she does is completely improvised. And major props to her because I think she did a really good job. Like when she answers the phone and she's talking to her mother, it you wouldn't know that she was just going off the cuff. It seems very intentional and thought out, and she deserves all of the credit for that. But after part two, Adrian stopped acting in film, at least in the States. She ended up going into voice work and, studying voice. She moved away from America for a time, and which is wonderful for her because learning voice acting and becoming a voice actor, she has said, really helped her and made her grow as an actress and as a performer. And I, in voice acting is something I have just so much respect for. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to voice acting and voice actors, but you can really, really see how great she is when she narrates this book. And so the basic premise is that think about Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Silent Night, Deadly Night, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In the world of the novel, these were all actual murders that had occurred. And then the movies based on them became the franchises that are basically identical to the real world, but in those versions of it, like Freddy Krueger becomes the Dream King, and it's the Silent Night slayings. They're all very close to what we know, and most of the final girls, the survivors of these multiple different attacks, it is them in a support group, and you see how they have dealt with their trauma over the years. And each of the final girls, now final women, some well into their 50s at this point, they are all of their names are nods to the actresses playing them. We have Heather, who is the survivor of the Dream King killings. Heather Langenkamp, who plays Nancy in Nightmare on Elm Street. And then there is Marilyn, who is the survivor of basically Texas Chainsaw Massacre, name of the actress from the film. Adrian, who survives the Camp Red Lake Massacre, Adrian King. And then there is Julia Campbell. She is she's the 90s survivor of Ghost was the killer. And that whole thing is Scream, Campbell, Nev Campbell. So yeah, that's just all of those fun nods. And then Danny, who is Danny named for? Sorry, even though I just finished the book today, there's a lot of characters and the book goes in a lot of different directions. There are many plot twists and red herrings, but it's really interesting to me how when discussing horror films, let's talk about the way the kills themselves, and how it was done, how fun and gory or schlocky it might be. But then when you're reading about that same gore, and especially done through a first person perspective, it's takes it in a whole new way. And the point of view character of the Final Girl support group is Lynette. And she doesn't have an exact, like, 1-to-1 film counterpart. She is the survivor. It's basically Silent Night, Deadly Night. And whereas the character in the film, I think her name was Denise, but she gets impaled on the deer antlers. That is her, but she survived and then is stalked by the brother later on. Yeah, so it's just Silent Night, Deadly Night part 1 and 2, but they have her survive. But her describing the murders of her boyfriend and her family and getting impaled onto the deer antlers and there's a lot of really gnarly injury in this book, and it just affects you in a different way when you're reading to it or listening to Adrienne King describe it, that it's kind of worse because yes, you still know that it's fiction. And of course, the kills in these films are bloody and many times just make you go, ugh, and turn away because it's gross or just, oh, it's really painful. But there is a degree of separation, I think, especially for somebody who has watched a lot of horror movies and who's a big horror fan, because you're not just thinking about it from like a character perspective, you're also thinking about, oh wow, like look at those great effects, and who was was it Tom Savini, was it, who did the effects for this, and oh man, like that was good, and that reminded me of this one in this movie, and oh, what a good prosthetic that was. And something that the book comments on is how if these were real events that happened, and in real world cases of someone being, of serial killers or, big names, it is sadly the name of the monsters that we remember rather than the victims. And in most of these franchises, usually the only name that people really remember is the final girl. Sure, maybe if you'd seen the movie recently or you're a big fan, you'll remember the other characters, or you'll remember who played them. Johnny Depp in Nightmare on Elm Street, Kevin Bacon in Friday the 13th Part 1. But I'm like, wait, what were their actual characters' names again? But we remember Nancy. We remember Laurie Strode. We remember Alice. We remember Ginny. And that is something that it goes pretty deep into that in the book. And I was actually talking about not just Friday the 13th, but a lot of horror movies, especially of the 70s and 80s, with my brother the other day. And, these movies were not critically acclaimed when they came out, and still are not. Roger Ebert never reviewed another Friday the 13th film after part 2, at least not in print. He said, I'm not going to write about it again. Like, my half-star review stands for this and any other one that comes out. And one big thing, yeah, yes. And, and I understand. Not everybody's cup of tea. And if I can totally get why, especially for a audience back in the 80s where violence and stuff, this kind of thing on film wasn't really seen much. This was all rather new. Now it's, it's a, their own tropes basically. But, I can see that with being such a new phenomenon that critics wouldn't get behind it necessarily. And many horror films, particularly the slashers, get the accusation of being misogynistic, anti feminist. And sometimes, yeah, I definitely get that. They're definitely, and, showing the gratuitous nudity. And even in part two, the actress who played Vicky, and the actresses playing Sandra and Vicky were both 17. At least Vicky was at the start of production. And Sandra and Jeff, they have the sex death. Sex death playing at the Agora. But originally there was going to be more of the sex scene itself, and there was nudity. Once the studio realized, oh no, she's only 17, that was cut, never be seen again. Good. But yes, these movies do have, they do have a thing with looking at women and with killing them. No contest there. But it's always a final girl. And even in something like I Spit on Your Grave, you can actually, like, I read that, obviously revenge fantasy and it's exploitation and it's difficult to watch. Not fun, but it is like these women reclaiming themselves in a way and eventually taking on and either defeating or surviving their attacker. And I think that is important to remember. And horror is a reflection of life and of lived experience. And why it, that's why whether it's, supernatural horror, slashers, there's always something that we can relate to in it, some kind of personal fear or societal fear. Like, that's where it all comes from. And, I think it's pretty safe to say that most women will feel some level of fear because of a man or men. And I'm, not trying to say, not, it's not trying to really say anything, but we do live in a world that it can be very terrifying just to exist as a woman. And yes, that is exploited in particularly slasher films, but it is awesome to see that, Ginny coming at Jason, like, she comes at him with a chainsaw and then is using psychology on him to get into his head and then gets him with the machete. It's great to see Laurie facing off against Michael throughout the Halloween franchise, and Nancy facing off against Freddy and, coming back to be a mentor to the new generation of kids in Dream Warriors. Like, and it's the final girl. And for me, as a little kid watching these movies and Friday the 13th, part 2 in particular, that always bolstered me and, made me feel like, if Ginny could pull this off, She can be like, she's so smart and she's cool, but she can get away and turn things back around on the monster. Well, you know what? Maybe I can too. And that is something I really appreciate about these films, about part two, about Ginny in particular, so much. And that I've carried with me throughout my life. And, in times of strife, WWGD, what would Ginny do? So I will leave it off there. My ping-ponging thoughts about Friday the 13th and Final Girls and Ginny. Much love to Amy Steele and Adrian King. And oh, do you guys like my shirt, by the way? I got this on Fright Rags. And I think they have a Ginny shirt that I really want to get. So yeah, that's something. Sponsored by Fright Rags, no. But Fright Rags, if you want to sponsor me, hi. Anyways, same shameless self-promotion that will never be seen aside. I am Aleece, and my friends, as always, stay spooky and beware Camp Blood. You'll be doomed. Doomed. Also, R.I.P. Crazy Ralph. Bye.